don't understand why I would have to go through so much. Somebody out there has to know something, no matter how small.
On the night of March 31st, 2006, every security camera inside and surrounding a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona in Columbus, Ohio, recorded the same impossible fact. Brian Shaffer walked in. He never walked out. Not through the main entrance, not through the emergency exit, not through the service door that led to a construction zone 1 floor below. The cameras recorded every person who descended those escalators that night. The attending detective reviewed 15 discs of footage and stated he was positive that Brian was not among them. Police interviewed every employee who worked the closing shift. No one saw him leave. Cadaver dogs swept the entire building. They found nothing. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, 200 pounds, dressed in an olive green polo over a white long-sleeve shirt. He was not small. He was not invisible. He was not a ghost. And yet the building appears to have simply absorbed him. 18 years later, that question has never been answered. Not officially, not conclusively, not by the Columbus Police Department, which holds sealed case files it has refused to release. Not by the 3 separate theories investigators developed and declined to discuss. Not by the surveillance footage the public has filed requests to see and been denied every time. What we know is this: a young man walked into a bar, and something happened in the space between that entrance and the moment his friends noticed he was gone. In that gap of time, something was decided. Something was missed. And whatever that something was, it has been protected, either by the walls of an institution, or by the silence of someone who knows, or by the irreversible weight of a choice that was made on a spring break Friday night when everyone still believed the world was going to make sense by Monday morning. This is not simply a story about a missing person. It is a story about what we assume when we think we know someone. About the moment an investigation calcifies around its first theory and stops looking anywhere else. About surveillance footage that shows you everything except the one frame that would explain it all. And about the distance between what a person projects into the world and what is actually happening inside them. If you have watched this channel before, you know what we do here. We do not speculate for the sake of spectacle. We follow the documented record wherever it leads, and then we ask what it reveals about the people involved and about the systems that were supposed to find the answer. Subscribe now if you have not already. What follows is the kind of case that does not let you go. To understand what happened on March 31st, 2006, you have to understand who Brian Shaffer was, not the version of him that emerged after his disappearance, shaped by grief and loyalty and the particular distortions that memory performs on the missing. The actual person, the one who showed up in the documented record before anyone had reason to curate his image. Brian Randall Shaffer was born on February 25th, 1979, in Pickerington, Ohio, a small affluent suburb on the eastern edge of Columbus. His father Randy was a businessman. His mother Renee was a nurse. His younger brother Derek was 3 years behind him. From the outside, the Shaffer family presented exactly what Pickerington was designed to produce: a stable, comfortable, academically oriented household where children were expected to go somewhere significant with their lives. Brian went somewhere significant. He was the kind of student who made it look effortless. Tennis captain in high school, well-liked by teachers and peers, high enough grades to qualify for Ohio State's medical program without apparent struggle. His mother Renee was the gravitational center of his world. He wrote about her on his MySpace page with a directness that most young men reserve for private thought. He called her the greatest, most wonderful person in the world. He listed her as his only hero. His relationship with her was, by all documented accounts, the emotional foundation of his life. He also wanted to play music on a beach and drink margaritas for the rest of his days. These two things coexisted in him not as a contradiction, but as a sequenced plan. Step 1, become a doctor. Step 2, make enough money. Step 3, buy the island. He was practical enough to understand that music on a beach does not fund itself. He was idealistic enough to believe that medicine was only the bridge, not the destination. This distinction matters enormously because it means that the life Brian Shaffer was living in March 2006 was never the life he intended to keep living. It was the infrastructure, the scaffolding, a brilliant, disciplined, high-performing construction that he privately regarded as temporary. This is not a contradiction. It is the central tension of Brian Shaffer's life, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything that followed. On his MySpace page, in a section meant to describe who he was, Brian wrote plainly, "I really love music, and this whole doctor thing is really just a job, only temporary, until I get my band together and put out a record. I want to own an island someday, or at least a beach, so I can listen to Buffett and drink margaritas with my señorita." People who knew him have debated whether this was sincere or a casual pose. The weight of the evidence suggests sincerity. He had a Pearl Jam tattoo on his right arm. He had been in a band in high school. The dream of a different life was not something he kept private or quiet. He put it in writing, publicly, and left it there. What he did not do was act on it. Not yet. He spent his first year at Ohio State's Lancaster campus studying business, then transferred to the main Columbus campus and switched his major to microbiology with a minor in molecular genetics. He joined the Alpha Epsilon Delta Health Professionals Club. He stayed enrolled through the 4-year medical program. By 2005, he was in the top 10% of his class. Whatever ambivalence he felt about medicine, it did not affect his performance. He was disciplined enough to pursue a path he privately qualified as only temporary, and he was disciplined enough to excel at it. He also had a girlfriend. Her name was Alexis Wagner. She was a second-year medical student at Ohio State, smart and serious, and by all accounts, she was genuinely in love with Brian. His family loved her. She fit in the way that the right person fits, without effort. His mother, Renee, had given the two of them a trip to Miami for spring break 2006 as a Christmas gift. By the time spring break arrived, the people around Brian believed he was planning to propose on that trip. He had reportedly asked his mother about jewelry stores. He had asked how much he should spend on a ring. None of this happened. Because on March 6, 2006, 25 days before spring break, Renee Shaffer died. Myelodysplasia is a rare form of bone marrow cancer. It does not kill quickly in every case, but when it does, it tends to arrive faster than anyone around the patient has prepared for. Renee was 53. She had been Brian's anchor in a way that his relationship with his father, Randy, never quite replicated. The documented record does not suggest an openly troubled relationship between Brian and Randy, but it also does not suggest the same quality of closeness. The warmth Brian directed toward his mother was specific and categorical. She was his hero, not his parents, his mother. Her death, according to everyone who knew Brian in the weeks that followed, rocked him in ways he did not fully show. He was 3 weeks from the end of his second year of medical school. He had midterms. He had exams that he could not defer without consequence. He pulled all-nighters. He kept his grades up. He scored an 86 on at least one exam during the week following Renee's death. That level of functional performance during acute grief is not evidence that he was handling things well. It is the opposite. It is evidence of a person running on obligation and structure because those were the only things still holding their shape. There is a clinical term for this presentation. Complicated grief, sometimes called prolonged grief disorder, describes a response to loss in which the normal processes of adjustment are disrupted, typically when the person grieving was unusually dependent on the person they lost for their emotional regulation and sense of identity. Brian had described his mother as his only hero. She had been the engine of his ambition, the person whose approval had shaped his choices from Pickerington High School through Ohio State's medical program. When she died, the engine stopped. What remained was a young man going through the motions of a life that had been, in some essential way, designed for someone else's approval. He performed. He kept his grades. He returned his father's calls. He held himself together in the visible dimensions of his life, and in the private moments, He asked his girlfriend to leave everything behind and run away with him. The distress showed up in his behavior, not his grades. He took the $4,500 tuition check his father gave him and never deposited it. The reason for this was never conclusively established, but the fact is documented. He asked Alexis to run away with him. Not metaphorically. He asked her directly, in terms specific enough that she remembered it clearly and reported it to police after he disappeared. "Leave everything behind," he said. When she declined, he told her she would eventually leave him because he did not know when he would get better. This is not the language of someone managing grief in healthy increments. This is the language of someone whose internal architecture has been destabilized. The structure is still standing. The schedule is still being kept. But underneath it, something has shifted in ways that are not visible from the outside. These weeks between Renee's death and March 31st are the psychological origin point of everything that followed. Anyone seriously trying to understand what happened to Brian Shaffer has to sit with what those weeks revealed. A young man who was performing stability while asking, in private moments, to escape from his own life. Brian Shaffer and Clint Florence had been close friends and at one point, roommates. The roommate arrangement ended before their lease was up. No official explanation was ever given. Clint moved out, or Brian moved out. The record is incomplete on the mechanics, but consistent on the fact. They had been living together and then they were not, and the departure happened earlier than planned. Moving out of a shared apartment before the lease ends is not a trivial social act. It requires either one party absorbing the full remaining rent, a renegotiation with the landlord, or a mutual decision by both parties to accept financial penalties. It is, by any practical measure, the kind of action that reflects a breakdown serious enough that continuing to share a living space felt less sustainable than absorbing those costs. Whatever occurred between Brian Shaffer and Clint Florence in that apartment, it was significant enough to make cohabitation untenable before the lease allowed them to leave. They continued to socialize. They continued to go out together. On St. Patrick's Day, 2006, they were together at a bar, and they had a physical altercation. The reasons for the fight were never officially disclosed. Meredith Reed, a woman who appears in nearly every documented account as Clint's close friend and frequent overnight companion, was present that night and played some role in reconciling the two men. After St. Patrick's Day, Clint and Brian did not see each other again until March 31st. That is a 17-day gap between a physical fight and the last night anyone confirmed seeing Brian alive. They spent those 17 days apart. Then Brian called Clint and made plans for the bar crawl. The dynamic between them, the early end to the roommate arrangement, the pattern of fights, the reconciliation mediated by a third party, the return to socializing, is a pattern worth studying. It suggests a friendship with real tensions running beneath a surface that both men were motivated to maintain. What those tensions were about is the question investigators were never able to answer definitively, because Clint Florence, as we will discuss in detail in Part 2, stopped talking. What we know is that on the night of March 31st, after the bar crawl brought them back to the Ugly Tuna for a second time, Brighton Zapko told investigators that she had observed Clint and Brian in what appeared to be an argument inside the bar. She could not hear what was being said. The bar was loud. She could see the body language. By 1:55 in the morning, when the escalator camera recorded Brian speaking with Brighton and Amber outside the bar entrance, Clint and Brian were no longer visibly together. What had passed between them in the preceding hour is not on any footage the public has been permitted to see. Friday, March 31st, 2006, the last day of classes before spring break. Brian had dinner with his father at the Outback Steakhouse in Reynoldsburg around 6 in the evening. Randy later told NBC that the Outback had been his and Renee's favorite restaurant. He ordered the meal they used to share together. He cried at the table. Brian told him, "It's all right, Dad. I'll be with you as much as I can." Randy has described Brian that evening as not depressed, but exhausted and anxious to go out. The word anxious is ambiguous, and Randy himself acknowledged it. Eager to go out is one reading. On edge about something is another. There is no way to adjudicate between them from the outside. Over dinner, Brian set up a plan to come to the family house the next day, Saturday, to help his father sort through Renee's remaining belongings. He was going to come. He said so explicitly. He made it a plan. He never came. Derek Shaffer, Brian's younger brother, had tickets to a comedy show that evening with his girlfriend Maureen. Brian called Derek before dinner to invite him out for drinks later. Derek said he would try to make it after the show. He did not make it. He called Brian around the time the show ended to say he was too tired and they were going home. This was the last time Derek and Brian spoke. Alexis Wagner was in Toledo visiting her family before the Miami trip. She and Brian had spoken earlier in the day. He told her he loved her. He told her he was going out that night, with the guys. He called her again at 10 that night, from the street outside his apartment. He told her he could not wait for Miami on Monday. He said he loved her again. Alexis would later tell investigators that nothing in his voice seemed off. She did not register concern. She went to sleep expecting to speak to him again before the flight. At 9:30, Clint arrived at Brian's apartment on the 200 block of King Avenue. They had drinks. Around 10, Brian stepped outside and called Alexis from the street. He told her he could not wait for Miami on Monday. He told her he loved her. Then they walked south toward the South Campus Gateway. The South Campus Gateway deserves more description than it typically receives in accounts of this case, because understanding the physical architecture of the building is essential to understanding why this case is unresolved. The Gateway was a development project between Ohio State University and the City of Columbus, built explicitly to address the high crime rates in the off-campus districts surrounding the university. The neighborhood along North High Street had a documented history of violence. The Gateway was designed as a contained safe zone, a retail and entertainment complex with a movie theater, a university bookstore, restaurants and bars, all monitored by CCTV and staffed with security personnel. It was, by design, a watched space. The Ugly Tuna Saloon sat on the second floor of the Gateway building. To reach it, you rode an escalator up from the ground floor lobby. There was no other way in through the front. A security camera mounted above that entrance recorded everyone who arrived and everyone who descended those escalators to leave. Columbus police officers were stationed at service exits and emergency exits throughout the complex. The Ugly Tuna itself had at least 2 internal security cameras, one covering the bar area and the escalator entrance, one that panned across the room and could capture the far corner, including, in some configurations, the emergency exit. The arrangement of this camera system reflects exactly the kind of institutional surveillance logic that feels comprehensive until it is tested. You monitor the entrance because that is where people arrive. You monitor the exit because that is where people leave. You install a panning camera to cover the interior. What you do not account for is the possibility that someone will leave through a door that is not designated as an exit, through a route that was built for supply deliveries and service access, through the one gap in the architecture that the security design never anticipated needing to cover. The Ugly Tuna's service infrastructure was not a secret. OSU students who attended the bar during the Gateway's construction phase had reportedly used the service corridors and construction access points to navigate the building in unsupervised ways, sneaking through unfinished areas, accessing parts of the complex that were technically off-limits, treating the construction zone as an extension of the bar's social geography. This was documented in student accounts and was known, at minimum to regular patrons, as a feature of the Gateway experience during that period of incomplete construction. What this means is that Brian Shaffer, a medical student who had been to the Ugly Tuna many times, who had been to the Gateway complex many times, who had socialized in and around this building during its construction phase, almost certainly knew the service door existed. He almost certainly knew it was not being watched. On the night of March 31st, 2006, the Ugly Tuna was doing what it typically did on a Friday night before a major break, filling up with Ohio State students looking for a reason to spend money and forget about exams. The bar was well known on campus for its $1 well drinks during its infamous ugly hour, a $10 card minimum that translated into the kind of rapid intoxication that kept its reputation alive and its liability exposure very high. Yelp reviews from the era described the mixed drinks as tasting like battery acid. Underage students were routinely admitted, with bouncers characteristically admitting groups in ways that always turned away one person, so the others had to decide whether to abandon their friend at the door. This was not an accident. It was a management practice. This is the environment into which Brian Shaffer walked at approximately 10:30 that night, after stopping first at the Short North Tavern and Brothers Bar and Grill to begin the bar crawl that he and Clint had planned. At around 1:15 in the morning, Clint picked up the phone and called Meredith Reed. She came to collect them. The three arrived at the Ugly Tuna together, and a camera above the escalator captured all three of them ascending to the bar. This is a documented fact, confirmed by the detective's review of the footage. Brian Shaffer was alive, upright, and entering a bar on the second floor of a monitored commercial complex at approximately 1:15 on the morning of April 1st, 2006. The next confirmed visual record of him is at 1:55 in the morning. 40 minutes later. 40 minutes in which he was inside the bar, off the escalator camera, inside a room that was monitored by a panning security camera that a security guard, according to Sergeant John Hurst, manually overrode at a critical moment. More on that shortly. At 1:55, the escalator camera picks up Brian outside the bar, near the top of the escalators, speaking with two young women. Their names were Brighton Zapko and Amber Ruck. They were undergraduate students who had been in a class where Clint had been a teaching assistant. Brian did not know them prior to that evening. He introduced himself at the bar. He was flirtatious. He asked Brighton for her phone number and, off camera, she gave it to him. There is a brief moment in the footage. Grainy, low resolution, characteristic of 2006 CCTV, where Brian appears to reach toward Brighton's purse. The exact nature of this gesture has never been confirmed. It could be his phone number written on paper. It could be his cell phone. It could be a casual physical gesture during a conversation between an intoxicated man and a woman he found attractive. The footage does not resolve the question. Brighton and Amber returned to the bar to use the restroom. When they came back out, Brian was gone. Detective Andre Edwards, who reviewed the footage frame by frame across 15 discs, stated with certainty that Brian Shaffer did not descend those escalators. He did not leave through the front entrance. That exit is ruled out. The emergency exit had an alarm that would trigger automatically if the door was opened and was monitored by a camera and a security guard stationed at the door. No alarm sounded. No employee saw Brian leave through it, which leaves the service door. At the far end of the Ugly Tuna, accessible through a corner of the bar opposite the main entrance, was a service door. This door was not locked on the night of March 31st. It led to a hallway that branched in two directions. To the right was a corridor providing access to rear service entrances for several other businesses in the Gateway complex, along with an elevator. To the left was the construction zone. The South Campus Gateway was still partially under construction in early 2006. The area accessible through the service door's left branch was an interior basement level. Concrete floors, unfinished walls, the kind of utilitarian space that serves as the skeleton of a building before the surfaces go on. In this area, there was a hole in the floor. It was 6 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 4 feet deep. It was the excavated base for an elevator shaft. Sergeant Hurst has been explicit on this point in subsequent interviews. This was not an open-air construction site with shifting dirt and machinery and workers who might have missed a person in the chaos. This was a clean, finished concrete basement. A hole in the floor. If a 6'2" man fell into that hole and lost consciousness, he would have been visible to anyone who walked through that area. He would not have disappeared. Workers would have seen him when they returned. Hurst states he is 100% certain Brian is not, and never was, in that construction site. Cadaver dogs were brought through the entire Gateway building. They found no trace of Brian inside the building. They did, however, pick up a trail in the back alley between the parking garage and the gateway structure. The trail was uncertain. The dogs could not confirm they were following Brian specifically, but it suggested movement through the exterior of the building after the last camera sighting. Those dogs were then tracked further north. They traced a route that ended in the parking lot of a Wendy's restaurant approximately 300 meters from the Ugly Tuna. The trail stopped there. Wendy's had surveillance footage of its drive-through from that night, but not of the parking lot. No image of Brian was recovered. There are 3 possible explanations for why a scent trail ends in a parking lot. The person entered a vehicle and drove away, at which point the scent is no longer on the ground and the trail becomes untraceable. The scent degraded due to time, foot traffic, or environmental conditions before the dogs arrived, and the apparent terminus is simply where the reliable signal ran out, or the dogs picked up an incidental scent. The smell of food from a fast food restaurant drawing a working dog off a human trail at the point where the 2 scents intersected. Investigators were working with dogs that were deployed 72 hours after the disappearance. 3 full days had passed. The gateway complex and the alley. Behind it had been active with foot traffic, security personnel, deliveries, and the normal volume of a busy urban campus entertainment district. Whatever scent Brian Shaffer had left on that route had been competing with every other molecule in the atmosphere for 3 days before anyone thought to follow it. This is not a criticism of the dog handlers. It is a structural observation about what a 72-hour delay costs an investigation. The sniffer dogs tracked him going out the back and over to a Wendy's parking lot. That is the last physical trace of Brian Shaffer. A scent trail ending in a parking lot at a fast food restaurant on a Friday night. 200 meters from the last bar, he was confirmed to have been inside. He either got into a vehicle there, or the trail ended because the scent degraded, or the dogs lost the thread. The record does not resolve which of these is true. What the record does resolve is that Brian Shaffer left the Ugly Tuna Saloon through a route that the security system was not designed to monitor. He exited a building that was supposed to be a watched space, through a door that no one was watching at the moment he used it. In a complex built explicitly to keep Ohio State students safe, a young man found the gap in the surveillance architecture and walked through it. Whether he did so deliberately is the question that divides every serious analysis of this case. Clinton and Meredith remained at the bar until closing. When they realized Brian was gone, they searched. They checked the bathrooms. They walked the floor. They called his phone. It went directly to voicemail. Meredith left a message. "Where the hell are you?" They assumed, as people assume when a friend vanishes near closing time at a bar they know he has wandered away from before, that Brian had left on his own, that his phone had died, that he had crashed somewhere or gone home with someone or simply started walking. They drove to a house in Clintonville where Clint was house-sitting for a professor. They went to sleep. The next morning, April 1st, Meredith drove Clint back to Brian's apartment. His car was still parked outside. This registered as ambiguous rather than alarming. He might have slept at someone else's place. He might be sleeping off the night inside. They did not knock. They did not check. Clint picked up his own car and drove back to Clintonville. Meredith went home. This decision, the decision not to knock, not to check, to absorb the presence of the parked car into the most convenient explanation, is the first of several moments in this case where a small choice produced a very large consequence. Had Clint or Meredith knocked on that door on the morning of April 1st, they would have confirmed within hours that Brian was not inside his apartment and had not returned. That confirmation, arriving Saturday morning rather than Sunday evening, might have initiated a search while the trail was still warm, before dumpsters were emptied, before whatever scent the dogs later followed had been disrupted by 2 days of foot traffic and weather. They did not knock. Alexis Wagner was in Toledo. She had been calling Brian's phone since Friday night. No answer, no ring. Voicemail each time. By Sunday morning, the silence was no longer interpretable as a hangover. She drove back to Columbus and went directly to Brian's apartment. His books were where he had left them after his exams. His glasses were on the table. His car was in its space. Nothing had been disturbed. She called Randy. Randy called Derek. Derek drove to the apartment and confirmed what Alexis had already understood. Brian was missing. The family filed a missing persons report that Sunday evening, April 2nd. Brian Shaffer had been gone for approximately 42 hours by the time that report was filed. 42 hours in which dumpsters had been emptied on their normal municipal schedule. 42 hours in which foot traffic had disrupted the exterior of the Gateway complex. 42 hours in which whatever choices had been made on the night of March 31st had been given time to become permanent. The Columbus Police Department did not treat the case as urgent at first, which is documented by their own subsequent acknowledgement that something was wrong only when Brian missed his Monday morning flight to Miami with Alexis. A young man vanishing from a college bar after a night of drinking was not, in the initial hours, categorized as a crisis. He was 27. He had been known to disappear for stretches without telling anyone. His family had said as much. 2 years earlier, he had vanished for a week and called from the Caribbean to explain himself. So the logic was reasonable. Not right, but reasonable. It is the kind of logic that produces delays in cases involving young men who drink and occasionally disappear, because those cases have a survival rate that creates a baseline assumption. The problem with baseline assumptions is what they cost when they are wrong. By Monday morning, when the assumption was no longer supportable, police pulled 15 discs of CCTV footage from the Ugly Tuna and all surrounding businesses. Detective Andre Edwards reviewed those discs. He was thorough. His conclusion, stated with the kind of certainty that investigators rarely deploy publicly, was that Brian Shaffer did not leave through the front of that building. Not through the escalators. Not through the main entrance. The camera above those escalators had him entering at 1:15. It never had him leaving. The investigation that followed was significant in scale. Within weeks, national media had descended on Columbus. The reward fund grew. Ohio State University and Crime Stoppers jointly offered $7,000 for information leading to Brian's whereabouts. Hundreds of tips came in. Cadaver dogs swept the building. The Olentangy River was searched by volunteers who waded into the water and walked the banks for hours. Dumpsters were examined. Brian's bank and credit card activity was monitored and confirmed to have stopped completely after his disappearance. The $4,500 tuition check from his father remained undeposited, his accounts showing no activity after the night of March 31st. Randy Shaffer, in the months that followed, became one of the most visible parents in Ohio's missing persons community. He organized rallies. He used money from Brian's reward fund to help other families of the missing. He attended events. He spoke to media. He kept his son's name in circulation with the kind of sustained effort that grief produces when there is no body to bury and no verdict to accept. In those early months, Randy Shaffer was the public face of the search for Brian Shaffer, and his image was that of a devoted father who had already lost his wife and refused to accept the loss of his son. We will return to Randy in part 2, because the image he projected and the man he was, as documented by multiple investigative sources, did not entirely coincide, and because the Columbus Police Department did, at some point in their investigation, conduct cadaver dog searches of Randy Shaffer's home and property. Those searches have never been publicly explained, but the investigation was also shaped, from its earliest days, by a fundamental problem. The footage it had was incomplete. The most important camera, the one inside the Ugly Tuna that panned across the room, had not fully done its job at the critical moment. According to Sergeant Hurst, the footage showed the camera beginning to pan in the direction of the far corner of the bar, toward the area where the service door was located, before a security guard manually overrode the pan and redirected it. Hurst described the footage as appearing to show the camera starting to respond to something and then being stopped. This detail has never been fully explained. It was not a malfunction. Someone made a decision in real time to point the camera somewhere other than where it was automatically tracking. Whether that decision was routine or reflexive or something else entirely, the result was the same. The moment Brian Shaffer reached the service door, or the far corner of the bar, or wherever he went in those final minutes before vanishing, the camera that might have recorded his exit was looking somewhere else. The public has filed requests for the full footage. The Columbus Police Department has declined every time. There is something important to sit with here before we move further into the timeline. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was a bar with a documented history of serving underage students, with bouncers using management practices that would have endangered its liquor license if documented by police. The Gateway Complex was a development built, with public funding and private backing specifically to be a monitored safe zone. The bar's relationship with law enforcement was therefore complex from the beginning, cooperative enough to survive, but not transparent enough to invite scrutiny. When the Columbus police began their investigation, the Ugly Tuna cooperated. They handed over footage. They allowed dogs through the building. They answered questions. But the cooperation of an institution with something to protect is not the same as the transparency of an institution with nothing to hide. There is a difference between giving investigators what they ask for and giving them everything that exists. What investigators had was a curated set of images from inside a building that had reasons of its own to manage what was visible. Whether that curation was deliberate, incidental, or simply the result of a surveillance system that was never designed to be comprehensive, the result was the same. The exit route Brian Shaffer most likely used was the one route that no camera captured. In a building designed to be watched, the one door that led somewhere private was the door through which he disappeared. There is one more thing to establish, and it concerns what the footage that does exist actually shows in the moments before Brian walks out of frame for the last time. At 1:55 in the morning, the escalator camera records Brian in conversation with Brighton and Amber. The conversation lasts several minutes. Brian is animated. He is standing close to Brighton. At some point during this exchange, he appears to reach toward her purse. The motion is brief. The footage quality is what it is. Grainy, low resolution, characteristic of every CCTV system that was being installed in commercial buildings in 2006. You cannot definitively determine what his hand does. You cannot see what, if anything, was transferred. Brighton Zapco, in a 2018 interview, confirmed that Brian had asked for her number and that she gave it to him off camera. She described him as flirtatious. She said that afterward she and Amber went back into the bar to use the restroom, and when they came out, Brian was gone. In the same interview, she confirmed that she had witnessed what appeared to be an argument between Brian and Clint inside the bar earlier in the evening. After the interview was conducted, it was removed from the internet. A summary of its contents was preserved on Reddit. The Columbus Police Department has confirmed that they received the full escalator footage, which includes a detail that has not been widely reported. There was a third woman with Brighton and Amber that night who was not identified in any of the original reporting. That footage has not been publicly released. Sergeant John Hurst spent years on the Brian Shaffer case. He worked it as an active detective, and then, after he retired from the Columbus Police Department, he started his own private investigation firm and kept working it. Anyway, he has described the case as personal. He has said publicly that he wants to bring closure to Brian's younger brother Derek, who by the time his father Randy died in September 2008 had lost his mother to cancer, his brother to disappearance, and his father to a falling tree branch in a windstorm. The entire immediate architecture of his family gone within 2.5 years. Hurst is not the kind of detective who lets a case harden around its first theory. In a 2022 interview, he confirmed details about the investigation that had never appeared in any public account, including the cell phone pings that continued for days after Brian vanished, from towers on the west side of Columbus and near Kenyon Lane. Those pings were not the single September event that Alexis remembered, when Brian's phone appeared to ring 3 times before going to voicemail. Those were separate, earlier, and they indicated a phone regularly checking in with the network the way phones do on their automatic provider set intervals. A phone that is off does not ping towers. A phone that is destroyed does not ping towers. If Brian Shaffer's phone was pinging cell towers in the days immediately following his disappearance, from locations that were not near his apartment and not near the Ugly Tuna, then someone was moving with that phone. That someone was either Brian or someone who had his phone. Either answer changes the shape of this investigation substantially. And the Columbus Police Department did not tell the public this was happening while it was happening. This is the pattern we need to examine carefully in Part 2. Not just what happened to Brian Shaffer, but what happened to the investigation of Brian Shaffer. Because the two stories are not separate. They are the same story, told from different angles. Let us return to the people at the center of this case and examine what their documented behavior reveals. Clint Florence. The immediate aftermath of Brian's disappearance, Clint was cooperative and visible. He spoke to NBC. He spoke to MSNBC's Rita Cosby. He gave statements. He described that night. He was, in the early weeks, the friend who showed up and participated. Then, in May of 2006, he said something that changed the trajectory of his relationship with Brian's family and ultimately with the investigation itself. He told a reporter that Brian may have left the bar and ran his mouth a little bit. He added that Brian had been known to do that. This statement did two things simultaneously. It offered an explanation for the disappearance that located the cause in Brian's own behavior, and it framed Brian in a way that conflicted directly with the image his family held of him. Randy Shaffer disputed the characterization. Derek Shaffer, in a 2009 interview with the Ohio State student paper The Lantern, said he had always thought Clint definitely knows something and just won't come forward with it. Alexis Wagner's father, Tom, who had assisted in the initial search effort, put it this way: all roads to making progress on the case of Brian Shaffer lead through Clint Florence. Let us be precise about what Clint Florence's documented behavior reveals from a psychological standpoint, because it is consistently misread in both directions. The reading that indicts him goes like this: a man whose closest friend disappears, and who was the last confirmed person with him, does not cooperate fully with investigators, refuses a polygraph, retains legal counsel within weeks, and then says publicly that the missing man was known to be provocative and probably ran his mouth too much. This is the profile of someone managing their exposure, not grieving a friend. The reading that defends him goes like this: a man whose name is being publicly associated with a disappearance, who is being treated by investigators and by the missing man's family as a person of interest, has every rational incentive to retain counsel and stop talking regardless of whether he knows anything, because anything he says can be used to construct a narrative about him that may or may not be accurate. Both readings are internally consistent. The documented record does not resolve them. What it does allow is this observation: the specific content of Clint's public statements before he stopped talking positioned Brian Shaffer as someone whose own behavior may have caused his disappearance. That framing protects the speaker from scrutiny by redirecting attention to the missing person's conduct, whether it reflects Clint's genuine assessment of his friend, or whether it was a managed narrative designed to point the investigation away from other possibilities, is a question only Clint Florence can answer. He has not answered it. What we know about his subsequent life is this: he completed his medical degree at Ohio State in 2007. He went to Vanderbilt as a postdoctoral fellow in microbiology. He worked for the United States Defense Threat Reduction Agency from 2010 to 2014. He became technical director at Texas A&M's Center for Innovation in Advanced Development and Manufacturing. He worked as a non-clinical advisor at the Tari Group. He currently holds a position as a biodefense research program officer with work centered on infectious disease. He goes by William professionally now. In 18 years, no evidence has emerged that places him at the scene of any crime. No forensic evidence, no witness account, no documentation. The Columbus police have never named him as a suspect. Sergeant Hurst has never named him as a suspect. Derek Shaffer believes he knows more than he has said. That belief is not evidence. What is evidence is that Clint Florence observed something at 1:30 in the morning on April 1st, 2006. that caused him to stop talking publicly about what he knew, the nature of what he observed, whether it was something that implicated him or something that implicated someone else, or simply something that a lawyer told him was dangerous to describe publicly regardless of its content, has never been established. Shortly after that May statement, Clint retained attorney Neil Rosenberg. He stopped speaking to media. He stopped speaking to police beyond his initial interviews. When investigators asked the people closest to Brian to come in and take polygraph examinations, everyone who was asked complied. They passed. Clint did not come in. Neil Rosenberg's advice to refuse the polygraph was professionally correct. Polygraph results are not admissible in Ohio courts. The tests are unreliable. A false positive for someone who is genuinely innocent is a career-altering outcome. Any competent attorney would make the same call. This is not itself suspicious, but the picture that assembles from all the pieces together, the early end to the roommate arrangement, the St. Patrick's Day fight, the second argument observed inside the Ugly Tuna on the night Brian vanished, the refusal to submit to examination, the pivot from cooperation to silence, describes a person who concluded, at some point in the weeks after Brian disappeared, that continued engagement with the investigation was not in his interest. The question is why. The Columbus County District Attorney's Office, at some point during the investigation, subpoenaed Clint Florence to testify. Rosenberg went into a meeting with prosecutors. The subpoena was subsequently dropped. Clint was not compelled to speak under oath. No public explanation was ever offered for why the subpoena was withdrawn. Now consider Meredith Reed. Meredith is the primary public source for the events of Saturday, April 1st and Sunday, April 2nd, because Clint stopped talking and nobody else was present for those days. What she described is this. They called Brian's phone Saturday morning. No answer. They drove to his apartment, saw his car, assumed he had stayed somewhere else. Did not knock, did not check. She went to work out. Clint came over that night. They watched a movie. He went back to the professor's house in Clintonville. On Sunday, she called hospitals to ask if anyone matching Brian's description had been admitted. She went shopping in the afternoon and called her mother to talk about Brian's disappearance. That evening, she may or may not have spoken to Clint. She was not sure when she gave her statement. If you have been watching this case unfold across both parts and something about that Saturday is sitting wrong with you, leave the word "still watching" in the comments right now, because we are about to reach the part of this investigation that changes how the rest of it looks. The reason this reconstruction matters is its passivity. Two people who spent the last documented night with a missing man went through an entire Saturday of normal activity, working out, watching movies, sleeping, before the absence became urgent enough to prompt action. This could be explained entirely by the pattern Clint described. Brian disappeared on nights out. He had done it before. The most recent prior episode, the Caribbean trip 2 years earlier, had resolved itself when Brian called from wherever he had landed. So the assumption of benign wandering was not irrational, but it was consequential. And the thing that is harder to dismiss is the specific decision not to knock on Saturday morning. They were standing outside his apartment. His car was there. They knew he had been missing for hours. They did not knock. They drove away. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about a choice that closed a window, and windows in missing persons cases do not reopen. The financial dimension of this case has received less attention than it deserves. In the weeks before March 31st, two specific financial anomalies appeared in Brian Shaffer's documented record. The first is the $4,500 tuition check his father gave him, which was never deposited and never cashed. The second, which surfaced through investigative podcast reporting in subsequent years, is that Brian's credit card debts were paid off around the time of his disappearance, both of his credit cards. Cleared. This second detail is not in any official police report that has been made public. It was not mentioned in the early media coverage. It surfaced through reporting that involved access to people with direct knowledge of Brian's financial state in early 2006. The source of the money that paid those cards has never been publicly identified. Consider what this means in practical terms. A person in their late 20s in medical school carries credit card debt. That is not unusual. What is unusual is clearing that debt cleanly in the weeks before a disappearance, while simultaneously not depositing a $4,000 tuition check. These two actions are in tension with each other if you're looking at the picture of a person managing their normal financial life. They are coherent with each other if you are looking at the picture of a person who is preparing to sever their financial ties to their current identity, eliminating the trail that debt collectors and creditors would otherwise provide, while declining to invest further in a future they no longer intend to inhabit. If Brian Shaffer disappeared involuntarily, if something happened to him against his will in or near the Ugly Tuna, neither of these facts makes much sense. A person who is about to be the victim of an opportunistic crime or an escalating conflict does not typically pay off their debts in the preceding weeks, and a person who is carried away, killed, disposed of, does not leave behind a pattern of financial preparation. If Brian disappeared voluntarily, if he made a deliberate decision to walk away from his life, both facts become legible. Paying off the credit cards eliminates a financial trail. People who locate and chase debtors are one mechanism by which missing persons are sometimes found. Clearing the cards removes that mechanism. The undeposited tuition check in this reading was not an oversight. It was a refusal to commit another $4,500 to a path he had already decided to abandon. The question of where the money to pay those cards came from has never been answered on the public record. Brian's mother had died weeks before. She had a life insurance policy. The disbursement timeline for that policy, and the amount Brian would have received, is not publicly documented, but the timing is notable. What the financial record does not support is the interpretation that nothing was planned. Something was happening in the weeks before March 31st that involved deliberate financial decisions. Either those decisions were Brian's, made in preparation for something, or they were made by someone else with access to his accounts for reasons that have never been established. This is the detail that does not go away when you look at it carefully. Let us be direct about the framework investigators were working within, because it shaped every decision they made. In the early days of the investigation, police had three logical explanations for what had happened to Brian Shaffer. 1. He had left the bar and been the victim of a crime, robbery, assault, homicide, perpetrated by a stranger. 2. He had been harmed by someone he knew, either inside the bar or in the hours immediately following. 3. He had left voluntarily and did not want to be found. Each of these explanations pointed the investigation in a different direction. The first called for a search of the surrounding neighborhood, the river, hospitals, and the criminal histories of anyone in the area that night. The second called for deep scrutiny of the people closest to Brian, Clint, Meredith, and anyone else with access to him that evening. The third called for investigation of his finances, his communications, any planning behavior in the preceding weeks, and any indication of where he might have gone. An investigation running all three tracks simultaneously with equal rigor would have been expensive and expansive. What the Columbus Police Department appears to have done instead, based on the information Sergeant Hurst confirmed and the gaps in what was publicly reported, is allow those tracks to narrow according to what the most immediately available evidence supported. The immediately available evidence was this. Brian had been seen entering a bar. He had not been seen leaving. There was no evidence of violence. There was no body. There were no witnesses to any crime. In the absence of positive evidence of harm, the voluntarily disappeared explanation is the most convenient one for an investigation with limited resources. It does not require finding a perpetrator. It does not require establishing means, motive, or opportunity. It requires only accepting that an adult who had previously disappeared, who was documented to be under significant stress, who had asked his girlfriend to run away with him, had run away. The Columbus Police Department has never officially confirmed which of their three theories they believe. They confirmed in 2014 that they had 3 theories and could not discuss any of them. In the years since, they have declined to release footage and declined to answer public records requests in full. This is the institutional behavior of an organization that made an early decision it cannot now revise without implicitly admitting that the decision was wrong. Police departments are not built to absorb that kind of institutional admission. They are built to protect the chain of decisions that led to the current posture. Releasing the footage now would invite scrutiny of why it was not released 18 years ago. Publicly acknowledging the cell phone pings would invite questions about why that information was withheld from Brian's family. Naming the person of interest identified through the recent strong tip would invite comparison with the people who received extensive public scrutiny in 2006 and were never charged with anything. The institutional logic is coherent. The cost of that coherence is Brian Shaffer. What the Columbus Police Department has confirmed is that by 2006 standards, the investigation was extensive. Hundreds of tips, 15 discs of footage reviewed, cadaver dogs, river searches, interviews with everyone who knew Brian, reward funds publicized, missing persons reports distributed, and yet Sergeant Hurst, after retiring, started a private firm and kept working the case on his own time because he did not feel it had been resolved. That is the most honest measure of what the official investigation produced. Not its activity, its outcome. Brian Shaffer remains not found. The record remains sealed. The footage remains unavailable, and the man who cared most about solving it left the organization that was supposed to solve it and kept going anyway, on his own, because the system he had served was done, and he was not. The cell phone pings. Hurst confirmed in 2022 that Brian's phone continued to ping towers for days after he disappeared. The towers were on the west side of Columbus and near Kenyon Lane. These were not pings triggered by incoming calls. They were the automatic check-in signals that phones send to the nearest tower on a schedule set by the provider, typically between every 30 minutes and every 8 hours depending on the carrier and the plan. For those pings to have been generated, Brian's phone needed to be powered on. For the phone to have been on the west side of Columbus, Brian, or whoever had his phone, needed to be on the west side of Columbus. The west side of Columbus is not near the Ugly Tuna. It is not near Brian's apartment on King Avenue. It is not near the Olentangy River. It is not near anywhere the investigation was focused in its first 72 hours. If this information had been publicly released in April 2006, it might have redirected the search. It might have suggested that Brian was alive and moving. It might have suggested that someone had taken his phone and was carrying it in a direction no one was looking. It might have meant something important. At the very least, it was information the public and Brian's family had a reasonable interest in knowing. It was not released. It was confirmed obliquely 16 years later in a podcast interview with a retired detective. This is the moment in this case where the investigation stops being simply incomplete and starts being something more troubling. The deliberate withholding of evidence in an ongoing investigation can be justified on narrow grounds. You do not want to reveal to a potential perpetrator what you know. You do not want to compromise a developing lead. But Brian Shaffer has been legally declared dead. His father is dead. His mother is dead. The person who loved him longest and waited the longest is a physician in Toledo with 2 sons of her own, who spent a year calling his phone every night just to hear his voice. The case files remain sealed. The footage requests remain denied. Now, let us consider what the documented evidence actually supports about what happened to Brian Shaffer on the night of March 31, 2006. The exits from the Ugly Tuna were 3: the main escalator entrance, the emergency exit, and the service door. The escalator camera ruled out the first. No alarm and no witness sighting ruled out the second. That leaves the service door, the only exit not comprehensively monitored. The one that led to a hallway that could take a person either toward the construction zone or toward the rear service. Corridors of other businesses in the complex. There is a 4th possibility that has been discussed less frequently. The Ugly Tuna's 2nd floor sat above a Mad Mex restaurant on the ground floor. Part of Mad Mex's dining area was covered by a sloped metal roof that ran approximately 6 feet below a balcony accessible from a corner of the Ugly Tuna bar, the corner directly opposite the main entrance. For a person with sufficient physical capacity, it would have been possible to climb over the balcony railing, lower themselves, and drop onto that sloped roof, and from there descend to street level on West 10th Avenue, or the North High Street side of the building. Brian Shaffer was 6 feet 2 inches tall and 200 pounds. He was an athlete. He had played competitive tennis through high school. He was not impaired to the point of incapacity. Brighton Zapko told investigators he did not seem too drunk when she spoke to him at 1:55. A controlled drop from a balcony onto a sloped roof for a person of his size and fitness level, in a reasonable level of intoxication, is physically plausible. This route would have left no camera record. It would have deposited him on a public street in the middle of a university entertainment district at 2 in the morning on a Friday night during a major student bar crawl. He would have been one of several hundred people walking on those streets at that moment. He would have been invisible in plain sight. The sniffer dogs tracked a trail from behind the Gateway building to the Wendy's parking lot 300 meters north. That route is consistent with someone exiting through the rear service corridor, the service door's right branch, and walking north through the alley. It is also consistent with someone who crossed from the south side of the building and moved north through the surrounding streets. In both cases, the trail ends in a parking lot. In both cases, what happened in that parking lot is unknown. In September 2006, Alexis Wagner called Brian's phone on her regular evening ritual and heard it ring 3 times before going to voicemail. She contacted police. The cellular company traced the ping to a tower in Hilliard, a suburb on the western edge of Columbus, approximately 20 minutes from Brian's apartment. The cellular company told investigators this was a system glitch. When a tower becomes overloaded and the call routes to the next available tower, there can be a brief ringing effect as the system attempts connection. Sergeant Hurst's view, disclosed in 2022, was that this ping was consistent with a phone turning back on briefly, but that the evidence was not sufficient to draw a firm conclusion. It has been noted that Clint Florence was house-sitting for a professor on High Street in Columbus during the period of this ping. The house was approximately 20 minutes from Hilliard. This proximity is not evidence of anything. It is a geographical coincidence in a mid-sized American city where 20 minutes separates many things. What is harder to dismiss is the aggregate of phone activity. Days of automatic check-in pings after the disappearance. A brief anomalous ring in September. A pattern of a device that appeared at multiple points to be functioning somewhere other than Brian's apartment. Either the phone survived or someone kept it. There is one development in this case that arrived through the investigative podcast community rather than through official channels, and it concerns a tip that was described by people who were briefed on it as strong. The tip involved a name that had not appeared in any prior public coverage of the case. Not Clint Florence, not Meredith Reed, not the 2 women from the bar, not Randy Shaffer. Someone who had not been publicly connected to the events of March 31st, 2006. The Columbus Police Department has confirmed. The tip exists. They have not resolved it. They have not named the person. The case has not been closed. What this tip suggests is that the investigation's attention, for the better part of 2 decades, may have been focused on the people who were visibly present that night while someone else, someone adjacent, someone connected in a way that the initial interviews did not surface, remained outside the frame. This is the characteristic failure of investigations built around the people who are most readily available for scrutiny. The most obvious suspects receive the most attention. The less obvious connections receive less. And the less obvious connections are precisely where people with something to hide tend to position themselves. In September 2008, Randy Shaffer was in his front yard during the remnants of Hurricane Ike as it tracked through central Ohio. 70-mile-per-hour winds tore a heavy branch from a tree. It struck him in the neck. A neighbor found his body the next day. Randy Shaffer was buried at Maple Grove Cemetery on September 19, 2008. He was 53 years old, exactly the same age Renee had been when she died. There is something in the symmetry of this family's losses that demands a moment. Renee, dead at 53, of cancer. Brian, missing at 27, never found. Randy, dead at 53, struck by a falling branch while alone in his yard during a storm. Derek, the surviving son who had to arrange both burials, file the missing persons report, answer journalists' questions, and build a life inside the wreckage of what had been, from the outside, a picture-perfect family from a small, affluent suburb of Columbus. Randy had not been listed in Brian's online obituary under the deceased column. He was listed under surviving family, which means that when his own obituary was published, Brian was not listed under the deceased column either. He was listed as missing. In 2008, 2 years after his disappearance, the family had not yet given up the administrative hope that he was alive. 2 days before the burial, a comment appeared on his online obituary. It read, "Dad, I love you." It was signed Brian. It listed the U.S. Virgin Islands as the location. When the Columbus police traced the IP address, it came back to a public library computer in Franklin County, Ohio. The conclusion was immediate. A hoax, a cruel joke, the kind of exploitation that high-profile cases attract from people with too much access and too little conscience. But Sergeant Hurst, years later, introduced a nuance the initial coverage had not considered. When selecting a country from a drop-down menu, the United States Virgin Islands appears directly beneath the United States of America. A person intending to click United States, who clicks one item too far down, would select the Virgin Islands. Whether this was intentional deception, accidental miselection, or a deliberate red herring is something the IP address alone cannot determine. The question the comment raised, and has never fully resolved, is simpler than it appears. If Brian Shaffer chose to disappear and was alive in September 2008 and became aware that his father had died, the impulse to communicate something to him, even from a public computer, even anonymously, is not psychologically implausible. It is the kind of gesture that grief makes through whatever channel is available. Whether the comment was Brian reaching back, or someone attempting to manipulate the investigation's geography, or simply a person with a broken compass of empathy treating someone else's tragedy as entertainment, the record does not say. What it says is that someone, somewhere, wanted the word Brian on Randy Shaffer's memorial page. And then that word was traced to Ohio, not the Caribbean. And then investigators called it a hoax and moved on. In 2020, a photograph circulated on the internet of a homeless man seen in Tijuana, Mexico. Someone who had seen the age-progressed image of Brian Shaffer at 42 noted the resemblance and contacted the FBI. The FBI ran facial recognition software on the photograph. They determined it was not Brian. The homeless man in the photograph was described as American. Tijuana sits on the United States border, a 2-hour drive from San Diego. The man had reportedly been seen in San Diego in the months before the photograph was taken. The FBI's facial recognition analysis returned a negative result. Facial recognition software, as of 2020, carried error rates that varied widely depending on image quality, lighting, angle, and the age gap between the reference image and the comparison image. A 41-year-old man, photographed outdoors on a low-resolution camera, being compared against a 27-year-old man from 2006 headshots, represents exactly the conditions under which such software performs least reliably. The FBI did not send an agent to Tijuana. They did not collaborate with Mexican federal authorities to locate the man. They ran software on a photograph and filed a conclusion. Brian Shaffer was declared legally dead at the request of his family. He had been missing long enough to meet the statutory threshold. The declaration is an administrative act, not a factual one. It closes a legal file. It does not resolve a case. What does the complete documented record, assembled without assumptions, actually permit us to conclude? Brian Shaffer walked out of the Ugly Tuna Saloon through the service door. The scent trail supports this. The absence of any camera evidence of his departure through any other exit supports this. His knowledge of the building's layout and his prior social familiarity with the Gateway complex makes the service door the logical exit for someone who did not want their departure recorded, whether he used that exit because he wanted to disappear, or because he had arranged to meet someone, or because something else entirely was driving his movements in those final 40 minutes inside the bar. That question remains open. The financial evidence points toward preparation. Credit cards paid off. Tuition check undeposited. A conversation with Alexis in which he asked her to run away with him, and then, when she declined, told her she would leave him because he didn't know when he would get better. These are not the casual statements of a man whose plan for the evening was simply a bar crawl. These are the statements of a person who was, at some level, done. The investigative failures amplified the mystery. 72 hours before the search began. A camera overridden at the critical moment. Cell phone pings withheld from the public. Footage sealed. Records denied. A subpoena dropped. The people who knew the most saying the least. And underneath all of it, a young man who had written publicly that the life he was living was only temporary. Who had asked the person he said he loved to leave it all behind. Who had paid off his debts in the weeks before he vanished. Who walked into a bar on the last night of classes before spring break, and appears to have chosen, at some point in the final 40 minutes before closing, to walk out through a door no one was watching. The Olentangy River has been searched. No trace. The Ugly Tuna closed in 2018 and was cleared out. Nothing was found. The construction site has been a functioning commercial space for nearly 2 decades. If Brian Shaffer is in Columbus, he has been invisible to every search conducted since 2006. But there is a man in Tijuana whose nose the FBI software couldn't quite match. There is a cell phone that pinged towers on the west side of Columbus for days after its owner disappeared. There is a comment on a dead man's obituary, written from a library computer in Columbus, that said, "Dad, I love you," and signed it Brian. None of this constitutes proof of anything. That is precisely the point. Every missing persons case that remains unsolved after long enough becomes a mirror. The public looks into it and sees what they are prepared to see. The desperate see a man who is still alive somewhere, who made a terrible choice, and cannot find his way back. The cynical see an investigation that calcified early and never recovered. The suspicious see a friend who stopped talking, a father whose property received cadaver dog searches, a phone that kept moving after its owner supposedly vanished. What the case of Brian Shaffer actually reveals, when you follow the documented record to its edges, is something quieter and more uncomfortable than any of those readings. It reveals how easy it is to disappear, not from the world, from one world into the next. Brian Shaffer lived a life that was, by his own explicit testimony, not the life he wanted. He had a mother who was his anchor, and a grief that destabilized him. He had a career he was building for reasons that were no longer fully his own. He had a relationship he was both invested in and straining against. He had a friend whose dynamics with him had produced multiple physical conflicts. He had money that had been cleared of obligations. He had a building that, for the cost of one unlocked door and one security camera looking the wrong way, would release him from the record. Whether that release was chosen or inflicted, whether it was an act of autonomy or an act of violence, the result was the same. A gap in the surveillance footage. A gap in the official account. A gap that the Columbus Police Department has protected with sealed files for 18 years. Derek Shaffer has spent his adult life inside that gap. He lost his mother at 23, his brother at 24, his father at 26. He told a reporter in 2016 that if he ever saw Clint Florence, he would ask him, "Where the hell is my brother?" He has never received that answer. The reward for information leading to Brian Shaffer's whereabouts remains active. The Columbus Police Department can be reached at 614-645-2358. If you know something, or if you know someone who does, that number still answers. There is a broader pattern that cases like this one illuminate, and it is worth naming before we close. In cities across the country, investigative resources are finite, and cases without bodies generate less institutional momentum than cases with evidence. The missing who left no blood, no witnesses, no confirmed site of harm slide down the priority list. Their files stay open in the technical sense and are worked in the diminishing sense. The detectives who care most about them do so on their own time, with their own resources, because the institution that is supposed to care has moved on to cases it can close. This is not a failure of individual officers. It is a structural feature of how investigations are resourced and measured. Clearance rates are the metric by which police departments are publicly assessed. A case that cannot be cleared, no body, no crime scene, no perpetrator to charge, exerts pressure on that metric and therefore exerts pressure on the people managing it. The path of least resistance is to describe the case as actively under investigation, to decline to release information that might invite scrutiny, and to wait for a development that never comes. Sergeant Hurst built a private investigation firm around this gap. He is not unusual. He is one of hundreds of retired investigators across the country who recognized that the formal system had reached its limit on cases like Brian Shaffer's and refused to accept that the limit was appropriate. What those investigators know, that the sealed files and declined footage requests obscure, is that the answer is usually in the record. Not always in the most prominent place in the record. Not always in the part of the record that received the most attention. Sometimes it is in the secondary character who stopped talking. Sometimes it is in the financial transaction that no one publicly explained. Sometimes it is in the timestamp of a phone checking in with a tower on the west side of a city where no one thought to look. Brian Shaffer walked into a bar in Columbus, Ohio on March 31st, 2006, and never walked out on camera. That central fact has not changed. What has changed, across 18 years of investigative journalism, podcast reporting, public records requests, and the sustained attention of people who will not let this case go, is the density of what surrounds that fact. The answer is in there. Someone knows it. Whether they will say so is the only remaining question. If this case stayed with you, the rest of this channel is built from the same rigor and the same refusal to accept the official summary as the complete story. Subscribe. Leave a comment with the words, "Still looking," because that is what this community is, and what every person who has cared about this case has been since the morning of April 1st, 2006, when two people drove away from an apartment without knocking, and the window closed. Every case on this channel begins with a fact that sounds impossible. Brian Shaffer walked into a building and did not walk out. Kyle Collins's birth certificate had a 3-month gap that a bank employee noticed 19 years later. Nicole Vandenherk's disappearance was reclassified as a runaway based on a single tip that was never verified. The impossibility is not the mystery. The impossibility is the beginning of the real story, which is always about the systems and the people who were supposed to prevent it, and what they missed, and why. The camera was looking somewhere else. It always is. This is the institutional truth that every case on this channel circles back to. The surveillance systems we build are designed to cover the expected routes. The investigations we run are shaped by the frameworks we already hold. The questions we ask are the ones we already know how to answer. And the cases that remain unsolved after decades are almost always the ones where something happened in the margin, in the uncovered corner, through the unmapped door, in the gap between what the camera was configured to show and what was actually occurring. Brian Shaffer walked into a bar. He knew where the cameras were. He may have known which door they were not covering. He used it. Whether by plan, by accident, by desperation, or because someone made a choice for him that night that no one has yet been held accountable for. Like this video if it gave you something to think about. Subscribe so you are there for the next one. And if you have ever wondered about the case we should cover next, leave it in the comments. We read everyone. We always come back.